an abundance of proteins and micronutrients from a wide array of beans and peas, grains.
And of course, it's 8 o'clock here on a beautiful Wednesday evening. And as usual, we say very good evening to one and all as we get you ready for your Indaba program for today. Another packed program is coming your way. And of course, the Viewpoint African Network Conference, Rethinking Regional Integration in Africa, Atieno Ndomo. And the feature discussion today, the United States and Neocolonialism in the Caribbean. Guest Dr. Chenzira Kahina and the Honorable Chester Humphrey. And of course, the African Report, Native African Languages in Decolonizing Education in Ghana. So again, a lot going on. And certainly it should be a very interesting program coming your way this evening. So without further ado, let me again remind you that they will give you some numbers that you could call. And so if you want to get in on the program, you could basically do so. 306-3687. You could WhatsApp them at voice note. That's 306-3687. And I'm sure you'll be able to, they'll look at it and I'm sure they'll respond to it, of course. So once again, with so much to discuss, let me take you over to Shabaka Kambon and Dr. Fergus as they discuss a number of pertinent issues, topics that I'm sure will excite you and, of course, give you the kind of information that you probably wouldn't get any other place than with the Indaba program. Gentlemen, very good evening to both of you.
Greetings,
Good
Ruskin.
evening, my brother Ruskin, and good evening to listeners of 91.1 FM. Good evening to our listeners on Facebook and YouTube. And of course, that means good evening, good morning, good day, wherever you may be joining us this evening for another packed program of Indaba, program where knowledge grows. And of course, Ruskin, I think we need to compliment you for staying with us over the past couple of weeks. We appreciate that you have stayed on. We're beyond our usual hour. I hope that means that perhaps we can return to a 2-hour program on your station. That would be so great to return to that former status. But nevertheless, we appreciate that you have kept your audience beyond the 9 o'clock hour with us. As you have heard, for quite a long time, we have not had a live guest from the motherland or fatherland, that some people might say. This evening, we have such a person in the name of Sister Atieno Ndomo from Ghana. And of course, Dr. Chenzira Kahina may be joining us. I think she's on already, I'm not sure. But definitely we have a colleague from Grenada, Honorable Chester Humphrey. We will be talking with him as well later. Good evening, my brother. Shabaka.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Fergus. And of course, I think we got to let our listeners know what they're in for tonight. And before we do that, though, Doc, I mean, you don't make that distinction between motherland and fatherland.
Well, some people see that fatherland, some as motherland. Of course, we can justify both. There are matriarchal societies, there are patriarchal societies on the continent. So even on the continent, people have different perspectives in terms of motherhood and fatherhood as the prime reference point for them. So yeah, I'm not going to contest person's views at all.
Yeah, well, just for the benefit of our listeners, in my travels across the Americas,
I prefer motherland.
Yeah, the tendency is to refer to the country in which you're born, in which you live, in which you will serve, perhaps in the military or in some other capacity, as your fatherland. For example, in Cuba, there's a saying, patria o muerte, or fatherland or death. People who have come from all over the world to reside in Cuba under different circumstances all see this particular country as their fatherland. And that's quite distinct from their motherland, which is the place where they are native to, the place where people like them naturally occur. And of course, everybody in the Caribbean, many of the people in the Caribbean, not everybody, of course, but a large part of the population is from different motherlands in the world. I think there's that construct. So I'm not familiar with another construct, but of course, I stand to be educated, Doctor.
No, there's nothing to be corrected about. I prefer motherland from the point of view that motherhood, has been the backbone of the development of civilization in terms of the rise of civilization via the domestication of crops and animals and so on. And the first political systems were in fact governed by women, many thousands of years ago. It is women that maintain the prime, they are, in most countries, I would say, including in Africa, women are the prime conservators of culture. They're the ones who hand it down. So I look at things from that point of view. Besides, of course, I probably have some kind of special reverence for my own mother. So I have that sense of motherhood, motherland. Yes.
And of course, as we're going to talk about, our feature discussion tonight is the United States and neocolonialism in the Caribbean. We may talk about the fact that our former colonial powers like to call themselves, wanted us to see them as the mother countries. Anyway, so tonight on our program, we start with Dr. Fergus's Africa Report. And it'll be on native African languages in decolonizing education in Ghana. And of course, we do have a special guest from Ghana on the program who will get an opportunity to hear Dr. Fergus's report tonight and to comment on it. And our guest is going to be with us to discuss an Africa Network Conference. It's entitled Rethinking Regional Integration in Africa. So our guest will talk about that conference. And then, of course, we have our feature discussion. So lots to look forward to tonight on Indaba. And perhaps we could start right away, Dr. Fergus.
Yes, so let me give a proper title for it, or concept rather, of the presentation. And it's about the reclamation of national sovereignty over indigenous languages. And of course, language would have been a major target of the colonial project, or some people prefer to say the colonial situation in Africa. So that's what I looked at in this presentation with sort of, well, the intention was to concentrate on Ghana. But, as things go sometimes when you engage a topic rather than just think about it, I did a more comprehensive overview of the language situation in the continent, right? So, who crossed my mind just now, Sister Ayn too, while we were talking about that point of reference, motherhood, sisterhood. And I think I just want to drop in that little idea again, that, the idea of the creator, right? The motherhood and creation. God the mother is what I too would have said. God the mother, creator of the land and so on. So the motherhood behind the creation of not just humanity, but creation of the land itself. So with that in mind, Renee, you can bring up the report. It's a pretty longish one this time. So bring it up. Let's go through with it so we don't keep our guests from Ghana waiting too long. Over to you, Renee.
Don't use our mother tongue as medium of instruction. Either as a second language. Majority of the population of Ghana speak Twi.
So they told us that when you are a Christian, you must adopt a name which is essentially English or French. But they told us it's Christian. They even told us that our languages are bad. That's why I'm addressing you in a foreign tongue.
The first voice was that of I Am African, a YouTuber, and the second was that of Kenyan professor of law, P.L.O. Lumumba. In most instances, direct European colonial rule in Africa lasted less than 70 years. Furthermore, in most African countries, Europeans number less than half of 1% of the population. Over 800 indigenous languages are spoken continent-wide. Yet the language of education, the parliaments, the courts, and the media is invariably the language of the former colonizers. European colonizing projects relied much more on intangible weapons than physical force for the total subjugation of native populations. The two most powerful of these intangible tools were European missionary Christianity and European languages, which often depended on extreme physical violence to implant.
Your name is Toby. I want to hear you say it. Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name? Kunta Kinte.
That was a scene from the movie Roots. Religion and language have a symbiotic relationship. For example, European languages were deployed to achieve spiritual and intellectual enslavement of native peoples. The process began with baptism, or terrorism where baptism was denied, as in British slave plantations. For an African, one's identity began with naming in infancy. Ritualized naming was an integral aspect of African language and spirituality. Christian baptism, or terrorism as the case may be, was therefore the first frontal attack on African identity and culture by imposing the first layer of subliminal control. In this week's Africa Report, we look at the latest efforts by an African government to aggressively take on one of the existential expressions of colonial violence and remote control. That is, the imposition of a European language as the sole language of educational instruction, of lawmaking, law enforcement, and religious liturgy. This latest effort is spearheaded by the government of Ghana. But first, let us consider the broader historical and cultural context of the problem. Kenya's literary giant Ngugi wa Thiong'o believed that each language, no matter how small, carries its memory of the world. He emphasized that suppressing and diminishing the languages of the colonized also meant marginalizing the memory they carried, while preserving the memory embedded in the language of the colonizer. The struggle for proficiency in the colonizer's language compounds racial and class discrimination. French colonizers accorded citizenship to native Africans who mastered the French language. Most standardized IQ tests are culturally biased as they require a strong command of a colonial language. It has been proven that persons of exceptionally high IQ may fail a standardized IQ test if they lack proficiency in the language of the test. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was a living embodiment of the decolonizing of language. He changed his hybridized European baptismal name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he stopped writing novels in English in preference for his native Kikuyu, the language of the Kikuyu. Throughout his literary career, he continued to advocate for the use of African languages as the medium of African literature to throw off the legacy of colonialism and regain Africans' identity. Missionaries prioritized the establishment of schools, not to educate Africans, but to indoctrinate them. And language and religious dogma were the primary tools of indoctrination. One of the last and most extreme cases of linguistic colonization was the Bantu Education Act of Apartheid South Africa, enacted in 1953. Under this act, government took over control of education from the missionaries and enforced a policy of instruction in native languages to ensure that black students were prepared for manual labor only. Professional and other white-collar occupations required a high command of English, or Afrikaans. In 1976, A new law mandated that only English and Afrikaans be used for instruction in black colleges. This declaration provoked the faithful student uprisings in 1976, forcing the government to abandon the language policy. The first governments of post-colonial Africa should have prioritized the re-establishment of sovereignty over language. Countries, however, continued to be identified as Francophone, Lusophone, etc., one of the major stumbling blocks to African pride and unification, as PLO Lumumba has often told us.
We are the only continent in the world, as you well know, that still describes ourselves as Francophone, to mean that we speak French. These are things that divide us and define us. And those who claim to speak English would say that they are Anglophones, and that too defines us.
Lumumba's own Kenya came close to restoring linguistic sovereignty by adopting Kiswahili as the national language upon gaining independence in 1963. Although Kenya recognizes over 60 ethnic languages, the Constitution continues to recognize only 2 official languages, Kiswahili and English. Nevertheless, the older indigenous languages continue to serve as a means of cultural preservation, allowing communities to pass down traditions, values, and stories from one generation to the next. The Confederation of Sahelian States, comprising Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have influenced recent trends in demoting, if not decolonizing, colonial languages. The Africa Report previously highlighted Burkina Faso's radical move in December 2023 to promote indigenous languages as official languages and as the languages of educational instruction, while relegating French to a status of a mere quote-unquote working language. Mali also dropped French as its official language, but strangely adopted English instead, although aggressively promoting indigenous languages. In its new constitution, called the Renaissance Charter, Niger Republic, the third AES state, adopted Hausa as the new official language while relegating French and English as working languages. South Africa's 1996 post-apartheid constitution elevated 9 African languages as official languages, in addition to English and Afrikaans. South Africa's existing language policy states that students have a right to be taught in a language of their choice, and they should inform their school which of the 11 official languages they wish to be taught in when applying for admission. Interestingly, omitted from the list of official African languages are the oldest languages in South Africa and possibly the oldest living languages on the continent. These are the Khoi, the Nama, and the San languages. Advocacy for decolonizing the colonial English of Ghana began with independence. In March 2016, in the euphoria of independence celebrations and an election year, the Ministry of Education announced its plan to eliminate English as the primary language of instruction in schools, especially at the lower grades, 1 to 3. Last year, Kofi Boer moved a motion in Parliament for inclusion of the Nzema language in the syllabus of the College of Education in the Western region. Nzema is spoken mainly in southwestern Ghana, extending into Côte d'Ivoire. President John Mahama, a sympathizer of the revolution in the AES, has been credited for the bold move announced by the Minister of Education, Haruna Idrisi, last month for the nationalizing of the language of education.
The Director General of GES is here. You have emphasized that we should shift focus to basic education and to improve learning outcomes at the basic level. Mr. President, the story is told of a young girl whose teacher somewhere in the Ashanti region went in and was waxing English, teaching at that early stages of development. Then the child told the teacher that So, Mr. President, in line with that and with your authority, I'm directing the Director General of the Ghana Education Service and the GES that from today, teacher use of mother tongue instruction is now compulsory in all Ghanaian schools. The GES is to ensure strict enforcement of this. That child, that Ghanaian child, was not born into an English family, but a proud Asante Akan family, and deserves to learn. This is part of President Mohammed's reset agenda.
Idrisi explained that the policy is part of government's broader quote-unquote reset agenda to enhance the quality of learning, deepen cultural identity, and bridge language barrier gaps in the education system. Women have been the primary conservators of native tongues, especially as mothers and traders. Most African children grew up in a native language environment before suddenly being thrown into an environment of colonial language instruction at school. Yet students were flogged or suffered other traumatic consequences if caught speaking their mother tongue on the school compound. An Akan TikToker, Kobe Jubi, who applauded the new language reset, recalls these episodes of neo-colonial violence.
That was the Minister for Education, Honorable Haruna Idrisu, making it clear that from now onwards, the local language, the Twi, Hausa, Ewe, Gam, can be used to teach these kids.
You get it?
And it feels good to see this happening. At least what we went through back then is finally paying off. Those times there will be someone writing names of vernacular speakers, and the Friday they'll line all of us up.
You don't know.
Then go give you like you stole something. Meanwhile, you just spoke your mother tongue.
Living in a multilingual society would certainly present challenges for Muhammad's language reset policy, but avoiding facing it is not an option. The advocacy for indigenous languages in education goes beyond language reclamation and is part of the larger struggle for African cultural renaissance and the reclamation of African heritage in this era of reparatory justice.
Yes,
So there you have it. I don't want to comment again because it was pretty long. So a brief comment from my brother Shabaka.
Look, there's too much to unpack in that Africa report for us to just move on like we would normally do. You know, first of all, I think we could start by just acknowledging the suffering of our people on the continent and, of course, in the diaspora at different historical moments in terms of being forced to ditch their mother tongues for these colonial languages. I think we need to acknowledge that. And I want to remind people, if you want to get a sense of what that experience is like, there's a very recent experience right here in the Americas where Native people in Canada who were part of the mission schools there up into the 1990s. That means that, you know, the survivors of those mission schools who experienced that drubbing at the hands of teachers when they spoke their native tongue, they speak about what that did to them, what it did to their families, their ability to engage their own family members and so on who hadn't been through the system, and the torture that the trauma that they live with. So I think you know, I don't want us to sweep across that. I want us to realize what a trauma, has been caused across the continent and across the diaspora in this colonial process. Now I want to ask Dr. Fergus something. This was supposed to be an Africa report about language, but it really it turned out to be a report about language and religion and how the two things intersect in the history. So I want you to say something about that, but I'd also want it seems to me that you equated Christian baptism with terrorism. You use the two words. And just clarify for me if that is indeed what you wanted to convey, and if so, how would you justify that particular statement?
No, I don't think it's that. That is not what was said, But in listening, I think some people might hear that. What I said was baptism or terrorism as an option. So where there was no baptism, terrorism, and that's why I projected that scenario with Kunta Kinte again, that through baptism, people would have taken, as PLO Lumumba said, and I have always said, an European name that they claim to be a Christian name. So that was one way, but if not, particularly on the British plantations where they refused to baptize children, it meant violence. Physical violence was the means through which people had to change their name sometimes. Those who resisted change. That was what was said. Yeah. So just for clarity. I'm glad you brought that up because people listening might come to the same conclusion as you can.
You were saying that if you resisted baptism, then you were going to suffer terrorism. Terrible.
Now, I may have my personal view about baptism and violence, but that is not what was said in the piece, right? Yeah, it was an alternative to baptism. So the violence was an alternative to baptism. But we have our guests waiting on us. Good evening and welcome, Sister Atieno. Welcome again. And perhaps since I've been talking about Ghana, I don't know if you want to make a brief comment about the language situation there. Of course, you heard a little bit of treat in the presentation by the Ghana, a little cheeky girl, a very cheeky girl, of course. And yes, confidence, that kind of confidence that she had to assert a right to her religion, to her language in the school. So good evening and welcome. Just a brief comment before we engage in the discussion on the conference. Briefly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Fergus. Thank you, Shabaka. I feel very honored to be part of this conversation. It feels very natural. The things that you're talking about are the things that we're grappling with every day. So just first things first, Ghana is actually a second home to me. I am from Kenya, but I live in Ghana.
I was wondering about your name. I kept seeing the name. I said, but this is not a Ghanaian name. This looks more like a name from the Horn of Africa. So thanks for correcting me.
So I am, but it's easy to make the mistake because I live in Ghana. It is a second home to me. And really this should be how it is, that Africans can live in any part of Africa and, feel at home, which I really
but that's the beauty about the name too, because by the name I could have had a sense of where you should have come from. Right? So yes. That's the beauty of the native names. And that's one of the things, I'm projecting in the presentation. Language, because naming is part of the language and naming. You don't just come up with a name outside of your language and culture.
No. It's your identity. It's who you are. It's the values. It comes from, it defines you. And there's a lot that you can decipher from language. This conversation is fascinating because language is also about knowledge and power. So when you use languages that are foreign to you, it also disempowers you in the way in which you express yourself. So there's even just the basic level of taking away the power of how you think and how you formulate ideas or how you keep knowledge. So I think that one of the things that has happened as we have tragically lost local languages, and with the whole colonial legacy where it became almost criminal. I mean, I remember going to school and we were made to not speak. We had to speak English. So because Kenya is, a British colony, and so we all had to sort of behave like we spoke English better than our local languages. And the worst thing that could happen is that you spoke with an accent. And so this messes up the way you think, and the way that knowledge is carried over. So I really just want to say I relate very much with the conversation that you had. I know that Africa has been having this conversation about language. It's a tragedy that one of the ways in which Africa still, as with the colonial differences and distinctions, is we still talk about French-speaking Africa, English-speaking Africa, Lusophone Africa, where Portuguese is being spoken. The conference I'm just about to talk about, we have managed to do interpretation for 2 languages, because otherwise you're talking at cross purposes. So in Dakar, in Senegal, it is like French, Senegal. And so if we didn't have interpretation, those of us who are from Anglophone Africa would not be able to communicate. This is how ridiculous it is. So it is a big, outstanding business. If we're even thinking about unity and integration, it's something that Africa has to grapple with. How do we validate? Because we really invalidated our local languages. So it's exciting to hear that Ghana is being bold. And Ghana has been a leader for Africa, as you know, in so many ways. As a Kenyan, I am very refreshed when I'm in Ghana, because I still see a lot of culture. I still see a lot of the things that I am happy and feel proud as an African to see. So we look to Ghana a lot for leadership on these sorts of things. And so I am very, very encouraged by the conversation that they're having about, and at very high levels, with the kind of political power that you have to sort of enforce and validate and bring back these conversations to the table. But perhaps that's...
Guys, let me just find out.
Thank you very much. So let me formally introduce our guest.
Wait, Doc, before we move
Her
on.
name is Atieno Ndomo. As you heard, Atieno is a Kenyan name. She is a social policy analyst from International Development Economics Associates Limited, or IDEAS, IDEAS. And she would be talking to us about a conference that IDEAS, that is the organization, is hosting in Senegal, in the capital, Dakar, between the 26th and the 28th of November. And it's about the networking. And the theme of the conference is Rethinking Regional Integration in Africa. So, Shabaka, you want to, of course, engage our guests on this topic.
Yeah, before we start the topic, I just wanted to find out what, for the sake of our listeners, what did that young girl say in 3, Dr. Fergus? What was it that she said that sparked that the response from the authorities in Ghana?
I didn't get you, Shabak. I don't know if the guest heard, but I didn't hear you clearly.
Yeah. So, Sister Ndomo, if you can, if you heard Dr. Fergus's Africa report, the Ghanaian member of parliament, I believe it was, or authority in the education sector, he quoted a young girl who said something that drew the applause. And he spoke in an African tongue, and of course, I couldn't understand it, nor I imagine could our listeners. So before we move on, could we just get some clarity if anybody understood what that young lady said that was so witty and impressive?
So I will unfortunately disappoint you, because back to the point I made earlier. So as a Kenyan, I do not speak, I know very few words of Twi, which is one of the main Akan languages in Ghana. It is very possible that she was speaking in Twi, which for Ghana is spoken by most people. The minister you're referencing is the current minister for education. Right. I know that with online things, I could very easily make this my assignment and find this out, and then have this perhaps uploaded so that the full meaning and the full sense and weight of what she said. I think I can get friends tomorrow to let me know what it was that was said. If that
what she was saying essentially was that she speaks Twi, right?
Yeah.
She speaks Twi. That is what she said. And she said that at least the teachers should be able to speak a little Twi. little tree, right? And that one of them would take the seat. I didn't hear properly what was saying, whether the teacher should take a seat or whether the child would be taking a seat, but something like that. But that is what the statement was about, right? The extent to which street English was not a language, right?
Yeah.
Kata tree, kata tree. She speaks tree.
Okay,
right?
Excellent. Okay, at least we have the basic idea.
Right. If you would have heard crack, 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 crack refers to a little bit, small, small, speak small, right?
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification.
Right, so let's move on to the conference before time runs out on us. Let's move on to the conference. So, Sister Atieno, tell us about this conference coming up in Senegal.
Yeah. So it's actually two things in one. Ideas in Full is the International Development Economics Associates. So the Ideas is just a short form for that. And the key thing about this network, because it is a network and it's a global South network led and of and trying to facilitate connections between Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And so we are heterodox, which means that we're not doing neoclassical economics. We're trying to think about economics differently. So the conference is 2-in-1. And I say 2-in-1 because this is traditionally how Ideas does our convenings. We're very mindful about involving younger scholars so that there is an interaction between generations. A lot of the network members, so Ideas has been in place since 2001, so 24 years of existence. For most of these years, until only just 3 years ago, it was purely voluntary. All these professors were teaching economics and at the same time volunteering their time for this network. So membership is open. If you go to our website, you'll see how, if you're interested, you can subscribe and get regular newsletter and analysis and so on. But 3 years ago is important to mention because a change happened. So it was originally based in India, out of New Delhi. But 3 years ago, it made a move to Africa. So the headquarters of Ideas is now based at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, which partly also explains why I am in Ghana. But profoundly is that now this network that is a global South entity of thinkers, intellectuals thinking about economics differently is now led and the main operations are running out of Accra in Ghana. So the 2-in-1 is a conscious thing. So it will be a full week where the first 3 days will be young people discussing different approaches to thinking about money, to thinking about finance, to thinking about economic development. Now that's different because, as you probably know, neoliberalism is how most of the continent runs its economics. That's what's taught. That's what's taught to students of economics. So the Young Scholars events bring together advanced students. So it's students doing their second degrees and beyond. And it's their teaching session. So it's 3 full days of scholars from across the global South. So there'll be scholars from Africa, there'll be scholars from Asia, there'll be scholars from Latin America. We are trying to strengthen our links with the Caribbean so that we also have that. But they'll basically have 3 days of engaged conversations. So typically what happens is we have those 3 days of teaching, and then we have the main convening. So the 23, 24, 25 is the Young Scholar segment. And then we have 26, 27, 28 for the main conference. Now, the main conference, as you have shared, is on the whole integration of Africa. But we're saying we were wanting to rethink it. Why would we be wanting to rethink it? I think the context is partly what you are describing in the first segment of this conversation, is to say, after all these years, where is Africa at about being together? So it's happening in West Africa because in many ways, the integration in West Africa, the Economic Community of West African States, is considered to be the oldest of these experiments. And yet, even with that, I think you referenced the Sahelian states, the 3, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, who were kicked out of ECOWAS, and that raised all sorts of issues, is to ask the question really fundamentally, is why is it that the integration project hasn't got as far as one would have liked? And I think to that, and as heterodox thinkers, some of the things we want to flag around that conversation is the extent to which the integration project so far has been modeled along very neoclassical terms and understandings, and the limits of that. the fact that we see it only as like a means towards perhaps getting trade to happen better, eliminate barriers to trade and so on. Now, what that doesn't do, that doesn't ask the question, why hasn't this delivered Africa the sort of prosperity, the sort of economic sovereignty that would be the thing that you'd be looking for in terms of doing integration better? What is the role of economy and ideology in this conversation? What's the way in which you think about economics? So the 3 days will be very, very engaging conversations around what is the integration project. If it were conceived differently, what would that look like? And so we have a very interesting lineup of people. We're very, very excited about Madam Zakia being able to, our newfound friend, we're really, really happy to have made this connection. Look, we're having this conversation today because of this initial conversation. But if I were to just give a little flavor to our listeners and to say that the conference will be live streamed and it is free open access. So although there is a time difference issue, I don't think it will be too limiting. It is full days of conversations. We start 9 a.m. in the morning Senegal time, which I think you guys are 4 hours behind us. So if that's too early to wake up, people can join in the course of the day, dip in and out. We will also record all these sessions and that will be freely publicly available. So it means that the information will be available. But so, for instance, the evening that we open, we have a roundtable to look at the debt crisis. You all know how Africa is strangled by debt, which is such a contradictory, like why are we still in this place? But that's where we are. Countries are strangled by debt and it's a vicious cycle. Since I was born, we were talking about debt. I am now much older, we're still talking about debt. I will exit the scene, we will still be talking about debt, it seems. So it's to look at that and to look at also something that's interesting that seems to be happening. And as a Kenyan, last year, you may have seen it in the news, very, very encouraging organizing happening by younger people. Now, the continent is very, very young. You know demographically how young it is. So there's some promise in seeing the ways in which younger people, the Gen Zs, are trying to organize and interrogate these questions. So the Kenyan protests, for instance, last year were about questioning austerity. Why is it that lives are so hard? Why is it that economic policy is pushing people to, just indignified lives? Why is it that tax measures that are being chosen by the state are just denying people basic livelihoods? Imagine they organized what typically we think are very sophisticated economic discussions. They were able to present it in a very relatable way. So our conference roundtable will be looking at that, looking at the issue of sham elections, because what is the mechanism through which Africans get leaders? We are all following electoral democracy. And now the latest results on this are really not encouraging. You know what's happened in Ivory Coast. You know what's happening in Cameroon with a president who doesn't live in the country, who's 95 years old, who has just been coronated again. Heartbreakingly, in my neighboring country, Tanzania, led by a woman, what has happened just now, with returns where she's claiming to have won 98% in an election that really wasn't an election because you don't have a fair contest. But there are broader questions to be asked there. So what is it that can be a really useful Pan-Africanist response to some of these challenges? So we sort of know the challenges, but we seem to never really face the questions around what true meaningful alternatives would look like. And then we move into the main conference proper and start talking about things around what's happening in the world today. So everybody is getting more protectionist. Now, what is Africa trying to do? Are we still chasing the dream of integration as has been tried and has failed when the rest of the world is closing themselves off, when other regions are looking to alternatives? So what is it that we can think around those different ways in which Africa can face a more multipolar world? How do we look more inward, yet trying to go forward? How do we think around monetary systems in a way that, can be helpful? But then the security and defense question has to be tackled. We talked about the Sahelian states. We know how this is a stranglehold. So one has to ask the question, how do you do regional integration by understanding a very different security and defense infrastructure? We have a cast of really interesting generals for that discussion. From Ghana, we have a gentleman from Senegal, we have one from the Sahelian states. It will be interesting to hear from their perspective because security discussions in Africa are also strangled by the so-called war on terror, the influence and the role of the United States and some of the other Western states. I know that this is a conversation you're partly having later because look what's happening with the Caribbean now with the whole threat around invasions and so on, and trying to put the islands in the middle of this kind of warring and so on. So that's what day one will be, conversations around that, trying to tackle those challenges, look at opportunities, what really would be Pan-Africanist ways of thinking and rethinking about these things. And so it is 3 full days. It is, the last day is really, really interesting. We're calling it, I've just jumped to the last day because I think it's very, very exciting who we've managed to bring to the table. We managed to get the likes of Samian Kuruma. We have Julius Garvey. We will want them to do like a legacy panel on Pan-Africanism. We have Issa Shivji from Tanzania, Professor Issa Shivji. And so it's such an interesting mix. We're trying to get the ministers of foreign affairs from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal on a panel to talk about what are these challenges for integration? What might the future look like? So just to give a little flavor. So maybe I pause there, Shabaka, in case you want to perhaps ask questions. So I'm not rambling on further.
An important question for you. First of all, let me say that I'm very happy to hear that Nkrumah and Garvey there to speak. But you know, in the, around the time of independence, just prior to and thereabouts, we had our economists were celebrities. Those people who were planning, you know, how we would approach the question of how we'd approach the world from an economic point of view at independence. They were our heroes. People like Lloyd Best in Trinidad and Tobago. They visioned through the economic seas of oppression to find, you know, endogenous ways to develop and grow our economies. You know, that notion of thinking of the economists are sort of you know, died down. There's less fervor, less sort of interest in the work of the great economists. But perhaps within the sector itself, there's still some people who distinguish themselves. Who are the celebrities? Who are the people we should look forward to at this conference? Who are doing work that we should be looking at in the global south?
So let me
Sister Atieno, we'll have to make the response kind of brief because we have some other guests waiting in the corner there. I have a number of questions, but I won't ask them now. I don't know if you can perhaps leave a contact that I can probably communicate with you outside of the program. So just briefly, and then we would have a closing statement from you and we move on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That's okay. It's not all lost. So we'll share our website has all this information about the program and who's going to speak. We really do have some eminent. So like from India, I can just name names like Jayati Ghosh. You may know her. Professor Chandra Sekhar. From Africa, we'll have development economist from Ghana, Charles Abugre. We'll have a young, very dynamic Senegalese economist who used to be advisor in the office of the president, now works with ideas, Ndongo Sampasila. He's written books on this, alternative ways about thinking about money and economics. You will find it a refreshing space. It's not your usual economists. It might be the sort of inspiration you're describing. It means that their voices tend to be drowned out because neoclassical economics, neoliberal thinking on economics is very dominant, but that's precisely why ideas exist. To propagate and to put out there. And that's the work we try to do, these alternative ways of thinking about economics and training through research, through the analysis, and our analysis is publicly available. So I think we are open to conversations. People should feel free to write to us, look further to our website. And I'm really, really happy to have started this conversation. I hope it's not the last time that we share this.
Yes, and maybe we could bring you back, invite you again after the conference so that we can get some insight into what happened, the outcomes, and so on, and way forward. So thank you very much for sharing those ideas with us this evening. And of course, we kept you up pretty late, but you are invited to remain with us for the rest of the program. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I think I'll...
Yeah, so Renee, could you bring our next guest into the show, please? Yes. Is Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen, it's so nice to see you. Once more, good evening and welcome to the program. Dr. Chen needs no introduction, but just let me say briefly that she is a hard-working member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. She is a very powerful voice there, as in all of the other organizations that she is involved in, the Society of Black Archaeologists, another academic and sustainable humanitarian organizational development, and so on. And of course, she's a professor at the University of the Virgin Islands. That's very important to say. And that is in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Is Dr. Humphrey with us still? I'm not seeing him on screen. Otherwise, welcome to the program, Indaba, and good evening once more, Sister Chen.
Greetings, everyone. Hotep, blessings to just be present in the midst of all of the chaos that's happening in this region. So it's always a joy to return to Indaba for a variety of reasons. So just in lieu of time, because there was so much that I kept putting in the chat in regard to the preservation of African mother tongue languages, because I just returned from a conference on island languages and culture, which was grounded in the preservation of African mother tongue languages that was hosted in Dominico at the University of the West Indies in their global campus, literally less than a week ago. So I want to just extend my regards to our beloved sister Ndomo for just bringing up what's getting ready to happen in the continent that brings language to another layer. And I believe that you have a particular lens that you'd like me to speak to regarding the resurgence or the resurgence of colonization from a militaristic place here in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and of course, the Virgin Islands are at the center of this problem, being a colony. And I know Sister Dr. Chen likes to emphasize that it is a colony.
Correct.
It's living in a colony.
Correct.
So we need to understand that. And when we talk about neocolonialism, for her, it might be actual classic colonialism, but we need to consider exactly what we mean by neocolonialism in the context of the Caribbean in particular. But let me briefly just put it into a capsule. Before World War I, you had imperialists openly colonizing and recolonizing technologically weaker peoples. You know, that was how it happened, right? And in the case of the United States, we're talking about Puerto Rico, we're talking about Virgin Islands, of course, being colonized, recolonized, taken from, I believe, Sweden, one of those. And the Danish colonies as well, the Danish colonies also taken over and so on. Then Haiti and the Dominican Republic came into that, where they were simply recolonized in the 1915 onwards. But after World War II, we had something during the war itself, something developed, where the United States was in a sort of shared colonialism in many British territories. Well, that's how I see it, you know, via these military bases. But after World War II, you have this new concept, or at least conceptualized differently, in terms of neocolonialism. And I think the person who would have made that most popular would have been the first president of Ghana, Nkrumah. President Nkrumah, who actually wrote a book on neocolonialism. And I would just center on one quote from him in that book. He says the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it, in theory, is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. But in reality, the economic system and thus its political policy directed from outside. So he emphasizes the economics of control. This is what he's talking about. So everything is built around that, right? It's about economics. And because of that, the need for political control as well, or influence, as we see happening right now in the Caribbean. So could you, in your own way, define neocolonialism in the context of the Virgin Islands in particular, as well as the rest of the Caribbean.
So I want to take a moment first, so that for the purposes of the listening and audience and the viewers, especially while I sit in a non-incorporated, non-self-governing territory of the United States of America in 2025, that as we speak, there are US battleships in our cruise ship ports and docks. I want people to ponder on that without any authentic consent by the inhabitants and residents here in this space called the Virgin Islands of the United States, that everyone is very more comfortable just saying US, Virgin Islands is like a second thought. I want to give context, yeah? Because neo-colonization does not necessarily, it's not very new. It's just a very different form that people may not be as familiar with. But the colonization, usually we say neo-colonial because it's something new. But what has happened here from even in the late 1800s, when the Virgin Islands, what was then the Danish West Indies, not the Dutch, but the Danish West Indies, particularly, it was strategic. This has always been about militaristic interventions. I'm going to keep saying that. And I want to just highlight some, because I took some very copious notes from what I was hearing around in different platforms and different media platforms. There are certain reports that are coming out quite recent, as even today, regarding this, the illegality, as well as the unlawfulness. However, the familiarity and the common engagement of the US presence and thrusting their militaristic power in a form that represents everything fascist, everything quite anti-humanistic, and at the end of it, it looks like genocidal terrorism all over again. So when we say neo-colonialism in this space, it's where the form of colonialism almost becomes like acceptable by some of the leaders, that obviously leaders elected, appointed, selected, forced upon the people, because many times the people are not fully clear. They think it's that America and its military are here to protect the people of the Virgin Islands, when in actuality, the focus is that this just becomes a tool, a space to control the entire region, because we are literally geodesically in the center of the Caribbean spaces, from the south in the quote unquote southern states in the 48 contiguous US, as well as to the north of South America, inclusive of Central America, inclusive of our Caribbean islands. So I want to make sure that persons are clear, as you were starting to highlight, that the US involvement in the Caribbean space from its inception historically has always been around militaristic interventions, whether it was the acquisition of territories. We're talking like from the Spanish American War. We can go like 1898 and definitely slightly before, because slightly before we were dealing with a number of emancipations of paper in regard to freeing African and indigenous people to a certain extent, at least on paper, when in actuality there were certain economic influences, as you've shared, significant political influences, as you've shared, that were to create a more extensive, formal type of colonization in these spaces. And again, modeled around these European powers. Yeah. So let's say Spanish American War, 1898, and what transpired after that. There were a significant number of causes, a significant number of conflicts. There was territorial acquisitions that took place, whether it was the Treaty of Paris, whether people wanted to talk about what happened out of Spain regarding Puerto Rico, as well as Guam, which is another non-incorporated, non-self-governing territory of the United States of America. And of course, America's reclamation, so-called, of even Cuba, right? And then looking at the fact that the US even paid money, $20 million to be exact, for the Philippines. So this was like at the same period of time. So persons understand that this colonization piece, this militaristic presence that we see in 2025 has a very old grounding, a very old space of engagement. And that place around Cuba, that would be a whole different show, because then we would need to look at what people like to call the banana wars. Yeah, from the 1890s, specifically like 1898 till about the 1930s, give or take 1932, 34, right? Then you start looking at what the US Marine Corps was designed, engaged, intervened, specifically in Cuba, as well as in Panama, as well as in Honduras, as well as in Nicaragua. And again, looking at different periods of time, we can look at what happened right before World War I, what took place after World War I, leading into World War II. So that'd be 1910, 1912 or so, until 1930s. And then looking at what transpired in Haiti, which we still see the quote neocolonization remnants in Haiti based on things that happened between 1915 and 1934. And I didn't mention that space, not because it's a space I'm quite familiar with in my upbringing, but in República Dominicana, the Dominican Republic, that is a space that still to this day has the talons of colonization, like very, 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 very rampant, right? And then let's bring it forward from that space, because I would like for persons to be clear on this historical, the chronology, I should say, of what transpired to what we're seeing now. Yeah, that you had Cold War conflicts, you had a number of different US militaristic interventions that were considered quite significant. Of course, we speak of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 62, the occupation of the Dominican Republic in 65. Look at the closeness of years. And then people try to jump, but then we have to include this invasion in Grenada in 1983 that was grounded in this same thrust of maintaining, of strengthening instability, creating disharmony and disunity, and again, illegal, unlawful interventions in spaces that were moving in the direction of sovereignty. Let's just keep that in mind in the forefront of this conversation. And then, of course, with the Virgin Islands, as you've referenced, that was something that was in the making. Originally, they didn't even want St. Croix. They really were looking at St. Thomas and St. John, because that was carrying them. That's where all of their ships were traveling through, predominantly through St. Thomas. St. Croix is like where those rabble rousers, those freedom fighter, fireborn people, those Africans that like to run away and trip one thing and burn up everything, were residing. So there was a thrust in the latter part of the 1800s to control, again, this new type of colonization in these spaces, keeping in mind this is around the Mexican Civil Riots in the 1890s. And these are things that led to the United States government not even giving Denmark a choice. You're going to sell it to us, or we're going to take it from you. $25 million in gold, not fiat money, gold. Another reason why Denmark is such a wealthy, clean nation in 2025. And then we can continue this legacy onward into the wars that took place in other parts. These are this space, that whole piece of having Roosevelt roads in Puerto Rico, you know, using Target Wall. Notice the name of the place in St. Croix. It's called Target Wall. And people think it's some kind of, they don't even understand that this was a space of target practice for the US military for decades, inclusive of Water Island, that was still part of the US holdings formally until 1996, when they included it as a fourth island in the Virgin Islands. So I want to make sure that persons at least have like a breadth of understanding of what transpired. This is not a new form of colonization. It's just a 21st century resurgence of colonialism in these spaces. And I want to just, before I close out on that commentary, just use something that I found very interesting in From Columbus to Castro, The History of the Caribbean by the Honorable Dr. Eric Williams. They are not prepared to admit that the interests of the United States are necessarily concerned in every frontier dispute which may arise between any two of the states who possess dominion in the Western Hemisphere. And still less can they accept the doctrine that the United States are entitled to claim that the process of arbitration shall be applied to any demand for the surrender of territory, which one of these states may make against one another. And they were already talking about these things that we're seeing the same ramifications of in Venezuela, no. In Guyana, no. In Trinidad, no. In the Virgin Islands, no. And it's impacting how we move forward when we start to have this conversation about neocolonization. So I just want persons to be clear. As I'm speaking through a lens of not having any voice, any commentary short of what I'm sharing with you now regarding that the people of the Virgin Islands, do people understand the type of trauma when you see Iwo Jima docked in your cruise port? Do people understand what it is like for a population of less than 100,000 people spread out over 4 islands to see more than 4,000 troops just roll in every few days to a week? And persons only want to speak of, well, our economy will benefit from their purchases. How do you actually move forward through that lens? Again, colonization is not new. And capitalism and imperialist efforts have actually developed a form of resurfacing to a level that is just immoral, unlawful, and quite illegal.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, for giving us that introduction to the subject. One of the things Dr. Fergus introduced brother, the great Kwame Nkrumah into the conversation. And one of the things that Nkrumah talks about is the emphasis of the imperialists on undermining efforts at regional integration. Because in the very process of regional integration, there's a kind of, it provides some kind of security for smaller, weaker states. We see now that the CARICOM seems to be, suffering from challenges. There's some utterances from the Trinidadian leader, in particular, the current Trinidadian Prime Minister, which many analysts across the region suggest is both a reflection of a weakening of CARICOM and in themselves also serve to further weaken the regional body. Is this part of the whole thrust of neocolonialism as Kwame Nkrumah envisioned it?
I think that it's very challenging when we are looking at existing structures, whether it's CARICOM, whether it's the African Union, but anything that uplifts people of ancestral African indigenous ancestry, descent, legacy is going to be attacked and is going to be stretched, usually through exactly what Dr. Fergus mentioned, that economic driver, right? I think that what has transpired now in this region, and the reason why there's a significant amount of either silence or inactivity or not that same, quote, Pan-African revolutionary thrust and fervor, are because some of it is fear, some of it is, how do you navigate with a force as powerful as what I refer to as global America? Because it's not just America, the 48 contiguous US. It's the 48 contiguous US and their allies. Some that we see and some that we don't see. And how do you engage with that when they can just say, you will not go into airspace? You will have your visa revoked. You cannot generate your particular economic exchanges or transfer of dollars without our, quote, permissions, right? So of course, there's going to be a certain, to some people, compromise. Many times it'll be a compromise that is not in the best interest of the region, not in the best interest of some of these now sovereign entities, nations, etc. And I think it's really important when you make that reference to Nkrumah's publication in terms of neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Again, because capitalism and imperialist policies are pretty much so full-fledged on the full decline, dismantling, no longer functional. The only thing they could do now is genocidal terrorism and threat of power. That's why the US will come into this region and give the impression that they're coming here to protect, serve something, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, sexual trafficking, or whatever trafficking, when in actuality, they are at the forefront of some of this very damning, very destructive, and very demonic behavior in this region. So it makes me remember that in Nkrumah's work, it was about that sense of false independence, where persons do feel that they are completely independent, when in actuality, this situation now has shown if you cannot keep that beast out of your yard, you need to hold back. How are you going to deal with them? And mind you, we're also speaking of what Nkrumah referenced through that lens of the power of responsibility in terms of what systems, what external powers can hold influence on internal structures and socio-political structures, socioeconomic structures, as we've seen in the Caribbean spaces. Also, Nkrumah focused on that exploitation that is so extreme to the point that it literally weakens the very infrastructure of even entities that are newly sovereign. I want to highlight that part. And of course, the economic control. And that's what happened. That's what's happening now. That's why some people, I personally have seen every inch of effort to dismantle Caribbean unity and Caribbean civilization at the core of these spaces by the US government and their allies. And now they have certain support, even inside of this region that we have hold dear as the Caribbean space. So I'm very mindful of not using a 20th century paradigm and shift to be able to then describe this new climate change infused HARP interfered with man-made chaotic kind of damaging to our soul self, our physical space. And then on top of all of this, while you're trying to invade the space, you got hurricanes that we cannot even explain their speed or the level of destruction. Or if you have that much money to spend billions upon billions to start war, how about you just provide some housing and clean water and restorative efforts in this space? Why would you come into this space? What is the real reason that you would come into this space outside of just wanting to dismantle and create a new power at a time that your capitalist imperialist structure is completely disintegrating? I hope I answered your question.
well, I mean, you're raising all kinds of interesting points there, Dr. Chenzira. One of the points that I think that that you have touched on is the way that neocolonialism functions as, in the words of Nkrumah, a kind of breeding ground for what he calls limited wars. And he addresses this by pointing out that the growth of nuclear weapons has made out of date or old-fashioned balance of power, which rested on the ultimate sanction of major war. And now, because of the certainty of mutual mass destruction, if there's such a war between the great powers, they find themselves confined to these military conflicts or limited wars outside of their own borders. And so he says that neocolonialism, he suggests, because you're not the master of your own destiny, you can become the staging ground or both the location or the location of the war itself, the limited war itself, or the place from which you could stage such a limited war. So he says neocolonialism is a breeding ground for these limited wars. But I think we better bring in our guest here from Ghana. We spend a lot of time or not from Kenya, who we mistakenly thought from Ghana. One of the areas of neocolonialism, when we talk about neocolonialism, we're talking about all these indirect methods such as economics, politics, culture, and so on to control a nominally independent country. So economics, I know that's your area. What would you want to contribute to this conversation that we're having here, my sister?
It's very fascinating. So I'm busy putting things in the chat because I'm just fascinated by all the information and the presence of this moment that this conversation is happening. And yet in so many ways, these are the conversations we've been having for so many years. The factors remain the same. The lack of sovereignty, the interference that undermines any possibility of people coming together or being free, truly. So it seems that, just from the very beginning, the conversation around language, the fact that in our conferences, I was saying earlier, we're going to be speaking in English and French. We will not be speaking in any African language. The fact that you do not control your economy, and so then the debt cycle that I was describing, and what that means in terms of the choices that you then perceive to be the only choices that are available to you. And that's why the conversation around alternate ways of conceiving of how the economy is thought of are important. So a colleague, this young Senegalese economist that I was talking about, Ndongo, who's key to organizing this meeting, has this very refreshing thinking about. So the debt problem in Africa, for instance, is largely an issue of owing in foreign currency, because we borrow too much in USD, in euros, and so on. There's no reason why for domestic consumption, African countries and governments and central banks are not just printing money and paying and having money circulate in local currency and then reining in. So, but that's a conversation that you will not have. And why will you not have it? Because we still listen to the World Bank and the IMF and all the headquarters in the West that tell us about how the economy should be organized and how you think about money. So it starts with the thinking. Now, when you try to come together, and that's the reason why our conference is wanting to question the way in which integration has been understood. If we continue on the path we are on, it's a vicious cycle of going nowhere, because we're engaging on terms that are not, it's still very neocolonial. So we're saying neoliberal thinking. It's the same old, same old. So we have to think differently. Look, what's happening now should be like the wake-up call for, like, you must do differently. But somehow the world doesn't wake up to rise to the occasion when the occasion presents itself for us to, like, certainly do the opposite of what we're doing. But conversations such as this are refreshing.
But let's connect all the dots here, my sister. We have a country in just to our south, 6 miles off our borders here in Trinidad and Tobago, called Venezuela. And Venezuela attempted to try to bring its resources under its control in a way that it could be, the major profits from them could be directed to domestic use, to the transformation of the lives of their citizens. And they found themselves at odds with great powers who had been, traditionally seen the resources in the soil of that territory as theirs. And I'm not sure if there was any kind of political formulation that could take place in Venezuela that the great powers would consider to be legitimate if they were not allowed to continue to benefit in the same way that they had traditionally from the resources of Venezuela. And that brings us to the question of the continent of Africa. If the continent of Africa reorganizes itself in such a way that the resources with which it is rich are utilized for the benefit of the people of Africa, does that not bring it into conflict with those countries who are now benefiting from the way that integration and economics and so on are organized on the continent?
Absolutely. No, go ahead, my sister.
Dr.
Just quickly, not to dominate. I mean, quickly, that's precisely the point. That's precisely the point. You're in trouble when you seem to be doing the right thing. So the Sahelian states, I think, I was in Trinidad, I was in Barbados recently, and I was being told about Traore in Burkina Faso. That's the reason why they're catching attention, because they're daring to do the things that we've been told you shouldn't do and the things that will put you in trouble. But what's refreshing for a lot of young people also in Africa is seeing that they're actually daring to do. We know there are consequences when they dare to do, because this has happened in the past. This is the story of Lumumba. This is the story of Nkrumah. This is the story of Sankara. But that doesn't mean that. So what's refreshing is that there are people who are daring. Doesn't mean that it will be easy, and it will not be easy, because the status quo interests that do not want this to happen. But this is precisely the reason why it should happen. Linking to the Gen Z excitement that I have, and I think they need consciousness. So this kind of space, I'm going to flag this space of yours to because connectivity now allows us, for as long as we can do, to have these conversations when we can't do it in person. But I think that it's precisely these experiments of daring to do things in a sovereign manner for your people, in your people's interests, that is the way to go. But it means that you'll be up against a whole lot. But it means let's find each other. For the people who are trying to do this, let's protect what's happening in Burkina Faso. Let's talk about it. Let it inspire. Let it create demands in other spaces where, like the DR Congo. Why is the Congo in the state it is in? We know why. But so how will it break through? How will it break free? How can it be 60 years plus? It's still in the place where it is. I have to pause here. These are things that are very exciting to me to talk about.
Yes. And of course, we're coming down to the end of our program now. So Dr. Chenzira, you have an opportunity tonight to speak on behalf of Caribbean citizens across the region who are, who are concerned about the actions, being the utterances and actions of our Prime Minister in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly related to the zone of peace. You know, there's been a very disingenuous articulation about the zone of peace from our own Prime Minister. There's a bit of sleight of hand where she suggests it has something to do with our own domestic crime rate as it pertains to the transnational shipment of drugs and so on. But she was there when the discussion of the zone of peace was had, and the CELAC signed that historic document in Cuba. And so she's well aware of the meaning, the actual meaning of the zone of peace. And of course, it has nothing to do with the things that she's and her ministers are suggesting it does. You now have an opportunity, as you're here on Indaba, to speak directly to our Prime Minister on behalf of the people of the Caribbean who are quite disturbed by what is taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. What would you want to tell our Prime Minister before we sign off for tonight?
I first and foremost wish to express to your Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago that I am appealing to your heart. I'm appealing to your heart because I know deep within, beyond any external force that's interfering with clear judgment, that you know that the Caribbean needs to be maintained as a zone of peace. I know deep in your heart, the soul spirit part that dwells within you, regardless of the political leadership, the political interventions that are impacting your economy, because that I recognize, and again, have never been a head of state anywhere. So I'm saying this from a space of heartical respect for the people, not only of Trinidad and Tobago, but the entire Caribbean Americas, this hemisphere, that are impacted by the decisions of any leader allowing for militaristic buildup to continue against the people of this region. That would be part one. Part two would be to pull on reports that are clearly approaching, in this case, US congressional entities, to recognize that the US has an arsenal, and I use that term clearly, an arsenal of resources that do not require the interference in the Caribbean civilization spaces, so that we do not continue to create war in a space that has been relatively peaceful, regardless of the interference of drugs and so forth, for quite a while. And there are other forms to address law enforcement and minimize drug trafficking. There's a framework that even Venezuela has recommended that should be listened to. That should be part of the power sharing. I'm just encouraging persons to look at some of the reports that are coming out, whether it's through the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, whether it's through some of the commentaries that are.
I think, Dr. Chenzira, I think that everybody is now aware. I mean, if you're not living under a rock, that all that is happening in the region is pointing towards some kind of military intervention in Venezuela. People have actually stopped more or less trying to justify the buildup in relation to the drug trade. All of that has been carefully analyzed and picked through. And there are forces within the United States itself that are that are speaking directly to this question of military intervention in Venezuela. So when we speak now, we don't need to pretend anymore that this is even a factor. What we need to do, I think, is to be very clear about the use of Caribbean land and territory and water to invade our neighbor and to destabilize as a consequence the entire region. I think that we have to condemn, and of course to ask the powers that be to please find another way. The president of Venezuela said he's open to dialogue and open to peaceful measures to move things forward. Let's find a way to facilitate and encourage such a dialogue, so we don't have to deal with the fallout, the consequences of war in our region.
I just want to highlight that it's important that persons listen to some of the commentary that came even from the Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as recent as when Carafesta 15 was being hosted in Barbados, where she actually came, and that their ambassador made it very clear that peace was the focus and that there were other means to address these conflicts. And this was on the eve of all of these threats in the region. And we do not need US military, their submarines, their helicopters, their stealth aircraft. We do not need them, their warships, their battleships in this region. I need that to be very clear and understood, because it's without the consent of those of us that are.
Our Prime Minister, our Prime Minister hears you, my sister. And Atieno, please.
Before we close, Brother Shabaka, before we close, just a thought I would like on this particular question, and perhaps I know we are at the top of the last half hour, but briefly, Dr. Chen, I would like your opinion on this. France, Britain, and the Netherlands still have old-style colonies in the Caribbean. Yet they seem to be, I know they have apparently, I don't want to call it pushback, but they have expressed, negative sentiments towards the United States buildup. But to me, they seem to be complicit in the buildup itself. And that protestation is kind of, in my opinion, mere tokenism. So what is it that we're seeing? Is this the white supremacist club at work in the Caribbean? What do they have to benefit from the United States in a sense, aggressing against even their own colonies, because the threat, as you have said, is a threat against all Caribbean people. Could you just give some brief thoughts of that on that before we close the program?
I'm going to use a quote from the wife of Aimé Césaire, Suzanne Césaire. Why in the past have we been so unconcerned about expressing our ancestral anxiety in a direct manner? The urgency of this cultural problem escapes only those who are determined to put their hands over their eyes so as not to be disturbed from an artificial peace, and at any cost, even the price of stupidity and death. I'm going to use her words from 1942 that still apply now. Most of the French, the Dutch, the Danish, even the Spaniards, let's be honest, even the Brits, there's been a consensus. When I said the Allies, when I speak of the global America, very short, global America includes all of those same entities that have benefited significantly from seeing instability in these regions, like the Caribbean, like Africa, wherever we are, because they know our power. And it's time for us to just rise up and end these forms of capitalist imperialist domination, wherever they raise their ever so demonic crowns. How about that? I give thanks for just giving an opportunity, because I know this could go on for like we need like another half an hour to break down just that part. Yeah, but it's an honor and a privilege to be with Indaba and to just share a voice of many of our brothers and sisters who just many times won't say these things, because job security means a lot. Being able to be safe in the places where you reside, being able to travel freely without being detained. Because while we're speaking, people are being murdered, disappeared.
Yes, indeed. We have to keep talking. We must, and we are grateful to have a brave soul like you. We are blessed to have guests like you on the program who can speak truth to power. Of course, we know there are sometimes consequences, but of course, it's more important that we play a role in doing what we do, because if we don't, then who else would? We have a duty to our generation and the next as well to speak truth to power. So thank you so much, Dr. Chen, for joining us once more on Indaba. Thank you, Sister Atieno, for staying the course with us and for those brilliant ideas you have shared. I'm sure you have enriched the program in a way that it would not have been if you had not stayed with us this evening. Thank you so very much. And my brother Shabaka, of course, thank you. Thank you, listeners on 91.1. And thanks for staying the course as well, Ruskin. And to our listeners and viewers on Facebook, thank you so much. Good night. Facebook and YouTube. See you next week, same time, for another edition of Indaba. Good night, good evening, good morning.